Hey everybody, how's it going? Good to be here. Just a few things. I want to give you permission. Hold on, coffee's here. Permission to multitask. It's something that I do. I have to multitask. I have to have many things going on at once. This is the first time I've ever been asked to talk on Saturday. And Saturday during football season isn't the best time to be asked to speak. Now, the Trojans play at 1 o'clock, but if you are a fan of South Carolina playing A&M, we got some fans there. We got FSU versus Wake Forest. Go Wake Forest. And KU v OU. 14-7 still? Okay, I please keep your screens on. That makes me feel better that you're following the sport. And if something happens, shout it out, and we can all, glory in your team's, good fortune. All right, fantastic. Yeah, 3 million. I wasn't there when did they say it at the dinner that we hit 3 million? As soon as the Rangers game went 5-5, I had to leave. Because it's World Series and you can't miss that. All right, so how do we start this? My brain is in perennial Almanac mode. It's all I do if you know the show. So I find myself always thinking, what happened on this day and why does it matter? And so while I got the topic of C.S. Lewis last year, I've been reading and thinking about that. I also noted that I would be giving my talk on this, the 28th of October. So if you'll bear with me. It is the 28th of October, 2023. Welcome to a special live reading of the Christian History Almanac at Here We Still Stand in San Diego, California. On behalf of 1517 at 1517.org, I'm Dan Van Voorhis. Somebody wrote recently that their children laugh every morning when their dad plays it because I pause between my first and last name. And I said, I don't know, man. I was raised on NPR. That's how we talk. Okay, the Emperor Diocletian, roughly 245 to 316, is known as one of the great persecutors of Christians in the later Roman Empire. But he also famously divided the empire and the role of the emperor. Under Diocletian, the Roman Empire was divided with 2 Augusti, one on the Roman west and one in the Byzantine east, with a Caesar subordinate to each Augusti. Diocletian was an Augusti with Galerius under him, and Maximian in the west with Constantius under him. While this sharing of power put an end to the problems of anarchy in the empire, it would lead to 4 times the problems when it came to problems of succession. When Diocletian and Maximian abdicated in 305, there would be controversy. Their sons were passed over and political rivals installed. When those rivals proved ineffective, popular rebellions placed the sons of the abdicated Augusti on the throne. But these new co-leaders, sons of emperors, would not think so much of shared power, and civil war seemed inevitable. Maximian's son, Maxentius, ruled from Rome and was prepared to battle the Augustus from the east, the son of Constantius, Constantine. But things had gone south for Maxentius. On October 26th, at the chariot races, in honor of him, the crowds mocked the emperor. And news had it that Constantine was coming from the east to take Rome and consolidate his own power. And so Maxentius, the ever-superstitious emperor, consulted the local oracle. He was told that the enemy of the Romans would fall on this, the 28th of October. Bolstered by the news, he led his army out across the Tiber to meet his foe. But one oracle gives and another takes away. Constantine himself, a superstitious fellow, claims that he and his approaching army were shown a sign in the heavens, the Greek letters chi and rho. This appearing overlapped with the Latin for, "In this sign you will triumph." Taking this, at least in retrospect, as a sign from the God of the Christians, Jesus Christ, first letters of Christ, chi and rho, Constantine's troops routed Maxentius, who, trying to get back over the bridge on the Tiber, is said to have been pushed over and drowned in his heavy armor. Constantine was a lone emperor, and having believed himself to have conquered in the name of the Christian God, at least some point he did, he legalized the faith and paved the way for it to become the religion of the Roman Empire. This would lead to growth, to the calling of the Council of Nicaea in 325 and political advantages galore for the Christian church. But gone were the days of the Church of the Apostles. The narrow way became wide, and new generations of Christians would have to deal with the question, what if the things of Caesar are also the things of God? To whom do we render? And might the old wooden idols now be superseded by political idols? Oh well, it started on this, the 28th of October in 312 at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And I'll skip to the normal end, but I like saying it, and I hear some of you like hearing it. So believe it, the rumors of grace, forgiveness, and the redemption of all things are true. Everything is going to be okay. All right, so that gets me going, that gets the juices going, and now I'm going to talk about C.S. Lewis. And I was tasked with giving you the story of the life of C.S. Lewis, and this makes sense. I'm a historian, but it's a giant task. And so if you don't know the Christian History Almanac, what I've done is I've taken this talk and I've broken it into two. So this weekend, the weekend edition of the Christian History Almanac is the life, the biography of Lewis through his bibliography. That is, from his conversion and his first Christian works until his death in 1963. So you can download that. You can listen to it on your way back home. This morning, I am going to be focusing on the early life of C.S. Lewis, and it can be tricky territory for two reasons. Let me start by way of analogy. As a historian, there are few things I try to stay away from more than the American Civil War. I don't know, maybe it's my own experience, but the devotees of this war between the states get really, really intense. They reenact stuff and dress up, and that's fine, because on Sundays I'm wearing a Rams jersey, but they get really intense. And you say something and they say, well, actually, the rifling of the bullets took place. Okay, I get you. The fanboys and girls can get you. And sometimes it's like that with C.S. Lewis. So this talk is for the average C.S. Lewis enjoyer, okay? Some things might seem obvious to you, but I want to make sure that we tell a story that is graspable by all. Secondly, I have tentatively titled this talk, Young Man Jack. But after talking to my friend Grant about this talk, I thought perhaps Not a Tame Jack might be more appropriate. I love C.S. Lewis, and I talk about it on this weekend show. He is probably the theologian that I've read more words of than anyone else. Since I was a kid, not even a Christian, I would be reading the Chronicles of Narnia. Sometimes theologians bore me, but Lewis is peppy and inventive and interesting and lyrical. But I also have an aversion to hagiography. That is, treating Christians like saints and only saints. Give me that sinner saint, what the cool kids call the simile. A sober approach to C.S. Lewis insists that we treat him as a real person and one who could be quite frank about his own sinfulness and need of a savior. If you listened to the show yesterday, it just happened that it was A.N. Wilson's birthday. A.N. Wilson, a sort of notorious biographer of C.S. Lewis. You can listen to that show. But A.N. said this, interesting. He said, Lewis idolatry, like Christianity itself, has resorted to some ugly tactics as it breaks itself into factions. Hard words are used on both sides, and there is not much evidence of Christian charity when the war is at its hottest. So with those caveats, I want to get into the life and the context of C.S. Lewis so we can learn about who he was in the service of, one, making him a flesh and blood person, two, understanding why his faith, both in losing it as a young man and coming back to it, is so significant, understanding the role of apologetics in his own life, and then uncovering a side of the man which may help you better understand him. So let me take you into my world, the life of a historian how do we get into C.S. Lewis? Well, we start with context. Where was he born, when, and to whom? Clive Staples Lewis was born on November 29th in Belfast, Ireland in 1898. What does this tell us? First, it is just Ireland. There is not yet a Northern Ireland. The Protestant Catholic issues that will break out into the troubles of the next century are simmering under the surface. And perhaps you say, the famed English Don was actually an Irishman. Well, kind of. Let me get to his parents. Lewis was born to Albert Lewis and Florence Hamilton Lewis. The Lewis family from 1775 had been from Ulster in Ireland, but moved to Wales. The family moved to England, and then Lewis's grandfather married a Liverpudlian and moved to Cork, Ireland. Albert Lewis considered himself a Welshman, and Jack would too. And just to get this out of the way, the Lewis family had a dog named Jaxie, and when C.S. was 2 or 3 years old, he went to his parents and said, "From now on, you're going to call me Jaxie." And that was shortened into Jack, and so for the rest of his life, everyone who knew him called him Jack. So that's why I will be calling him Jack today. His mother, Florence, was the preferred family of Jack and his older brother, Warren, referred to as Warnie. The Hamilton family was Scottish, given land by King James VI. They would be of the Church of Scotland and then the Church of Ireland. That's the Anglicans. If you weren't a Presbyterian or a dissenter, you were with the National Church of the UK. The Lewises would worship at St. Mark's in Dundela, where the parents were married by the vicar, who happened to be Florence's dad, who also baptized both Jack and Warnie. This is their national and theological heritage. Albert was a lawyer, a talented one at that, who also wrote stories and poems. They lived an upper middle class life with servants in the era before household appliances. They lived just outside of the Belfast city center. Jack's supposed weak chest was one reason they moved. And in 1905, they moved to their more idyllic home called Little Lee, a home with a garden, a massive attic, which certainly contained at least one giant wardrobe. This is where Lewis began his life as a reader. He would write of this home. "The new house, as we continued for years to call it, was like a large one, even by my present standards. To a child, it seemed less like a house than a city. I am a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noises of wind under the tiles, also of endless books." A schoolmaster, a rather strict one and snobbish one at that, once commented that he had never met a boy who read as much as Jack. As a young boy, he began writing series and stories and drew pictures to illustrate these stories about talking animals, which borrowed ideas from Beatrix Potter and Kenneth Grahame, stories of heroic knights that became part of the larger imaginary world of Boxen, stories of Sir Peter Mouse, knight-in-waiting to King Bunny of Animal Land, who reigned in the 14th century, Tom and Bob Mouse, son of Ichthyosaurus, and of Ben, the frog, who would become a hero. In 1908, tragedy struck when Florence, his mother, died of cancer. Jack would write, "With my mother's death, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life." I don't think we can emphasize this point enough for the life of C.S. Lewis. He had something of an idyllic home, an older brother, a well-to-do father, a loving mother, health and books, and a faith that kind of generally held everything together. And then, around 9-10 years old, his mother died. Listen to this again. "With my mother's death, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life." Much has been made of his prayers at this time, these unsuccessful prayers to God. Jack, whose understanding of theology at the time was thin, it was more genie than Yahweh, the personal creator, revealed in Christ. And it was a tragedy for Albert as well, their father, who didn't know what to do now without a wife and 2 boys. Warnie was away at school, and so he would send Jack, his youngest, across the Irish Sea to England, to Wynard School in Hertfordshire, just north of London and east of Oxford. While some of his later complaints about school might be exaggerated, it seems that this school, Weinard, was as bad as he said. His older brother, Warney, who was there, agreed. It was run by an old man who seemed to relish corporal punishment. It was a one-room schoolhouse, one bathroom for all, one weekly bath allowed, and the sick room was an old attic. Warney wrote, "The stench in summer is one of the most abiding memories. They ate thick bread with thin butter." Jack would write, "It taught us to stick together, to support each other in resistance to tyranny." His reading at the time, according to him, was profane. Stories of Greeks and Romans, and he admitted that it was the scenes of cruelty that fascinated him. He would admit even arousing him. He was suffering the trauma of losing a mother, and into this void came being sent abroad where physical beatings broke in on a kind of innocence. And while he never had children himself, his love for them in their innocence and his need to protect them, to give them the good news of Christ, is a central theme in his life and writings. He wrote home asking to come home, and luckily his father allowed it. Also, the school Weinard closed down, and the headmaster ended up in an asylum. For a brief time, he attended school back home in Ireland. On account of his weak chest, he was given time to convalesce at home. Solitude and books would be his prescription for peace. But then he would be sent to England again, this time to Malvern, a spa town where Warney was already attending public school. And if you don't know, in Britain, a public school is a private school preparing you for university and also preparing gentlemen for that upper class life. And it was also a place suitable for Jack's weak chest. This was 1911. He was at the Cherbourg House. And this is where the young man Jack, perhaps the not a tame Jack, would emerge. Here he would meet Miss Cowie, a school matron who took a motherly interest in him. And she was interested in a religion of another kind, not Christianity as such, but theosophy, Rosicrucianism, spiritualism, and the whole Anglo-American occultic tradition. Jack would write, "I had never heard of such things before, never except in a nightmare or a fairy tale, conceived of spirits other than God and men. I'd loved to read of strange sights in other worlds and unknown modes of being, but never with the slightest belief. Even the phantom dwarf had only flashed on my mind for a moment. But now, for the first time, there burst upon me the idea that there might be real marvels about us, that the visible world might be only a curtain to conceal huge realms uncharted by my very simple theology." At this point, Jack didn't have much of a Christian faith. He wasn't a materialist, and so this occultism of Miss Cowie piqued his interest. That and perhaps something of an infatuation with her. She would be dismissed from the school for, among other things, being found holding a young teenage Jack in her arms. He wrote that he, quote, "underwent a violent and wholly successful assault of sexual temptation." He made friends with Pogo, his friend, a dressy man, a man about town, a man who gave him a desire for, quote, glitter, swagger, and distinction. This is all part of Jack's slow loss of faith. Whatever it was, whatever placeholder his self-designation of being a Christian was slipping away. A schoolmate at this time wrote of Jack as a witty, blasphemous, sex-obsessed schoolboy. He went from Cherbourg and Malvern to Malvern College, where Warney attended. And while Lewis, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, plays up the wickedness of the school, his brother was somewhat skeptical of his claims. I need to say here that with Surprised by Joy and Jack's autobiography, that autobiography is not always a silver bullet for getting to know how someone really is. Self-deception is real, especially when trying to create an image of oneself. I won't say this, I know this from personal experience, but I know this from personal experience. What is of note in this time was his budding friendship with Arthur Greeves. This is from 1914. They shared a love of Norse mythology. Atheism was never the temptation for Jack. Rather, a belief in everything, and that all of it was a kind of amorphous myth. Arthur and Jack would be lifelong friends and correspondents. I know there's sometimes a controversy over to how we should read or read into their lifelong correspondence. We know about Jack's eventual conversion because of these letters. We also know that he and Warney and his literary executor Walter Hooper would edit what letters we got to see and which ones we wouldn't. So I think it's fair to see in these letters two friends writing to each other, laying their souls bare, and admitting particular proclivities. Arthur Greaves had same-sex attraction, and Lewis admitted that he was a mild masochist. We know later as a young man at Oxford, he got drunk and offered men $1 per lash apiece. Jack struggled with his sexuality. I think it's fair to say, left the malformed faith of his youth in part because of the lusts he couldn't control. And just as he thought a prayer to save his mother was something of a request to a genie, so too was his poorly understood Christianity, that it was a kind of get-better pill, which would hopefully take if taken sincerely enough. So hear this, friends, at this conference and inevitably elsewhere where it's being streamed and listened to. There are things that don't immediately get better. Sometimes Christianity doesn't make things better all of a sudden, and Jack would realize this. Let me jump ahead just a little bit in the story to Mere Christianity and a little bit of autobiography. I was sitting alone at the Cocos on Woodbridge Lake in Irvine, California. I was about 18 or 19 years old. In my hometown, I had just come to faith. I probably had a cassette tape of the White Horse Inn in my 72 Super Beetle. I remember the booth I was sitting in as I was looking and reading Mere Christianity for the first time. And this jumped off the page at me. Jack writing, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he's doing. He is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof, and so you knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you were not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and doesn't seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself." I know I just jumped ahead in Jack's story, but this is the kind of thing a person can write when they have felt that slow, painful struggle of sin, when things hurt abominably and does not make any sense. In another part of Jack's story that isn't often told but can be found clear as anything is that he made a threat to his father that if he didn't get away from school, he was going to kill himself. Imagine the pain of a father, emotionally distant, especially after the death of his wife, with 2 young boys to care for, to send them off to school to make them gentlemen so they would make their own way in the world. The oldest Warney couldn't cut it academically, and the youngest is suicidal. So Albert leaned on an old teacher, W.T. Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick, or the Old Knock, as Jack and Warney would call him, had retired and would take on students as a tutor, a kind of alternative to school in preparation for the university. And the Old Knock had once trained to be a Presbyterian minister, but lost his faith and went into teaching. Likely maddening to many, Jack drank it all up. It was reading and argument and logic. The sophomoric games of school with uppers and lowers was gone in favor of pure academics, what Jack called red beef and strong beer. Jack would impress even the stoic Kirkpatrick and would soon be prepping for his exams to Oxford. But it was in a train station bookshop sometime in February of 1916 that he picked up Phantastes, a book by the Scottish Christian mystic George MacDonald. Here, the description of this book, Phantastes. It tells the story of the strange journey of a Nodos, who at the portentous age of 21 is a young man ready to cross the border into adulthood. A Nodos inherits his father's estate, including a set of keys to a dark oak cabinet that unlocks a portal to fairyland. At the outset of his travels, Onotos discovers a caravan stone image of a beautiful woman, and breaking into song, returns the lady to life. He is smitten with her beauty. If you were at Gretchen's talk yesterday, this is the beginning of Jack's baptized imagination. He wrote to his friend Arthur and said, whatever you're reading now, you've got to put it down and pick up this text now. It's important to see the connection to MacDonald, also to Arthur, who was a member of the Plymouth Brethren Church. These would be his connection, these threads growing into a rope, including G.K. Chesterton, who Lewis loved reading despite the fact that he was a Christian. Around this time, 1916, things start to get a little opaque. Jack is taking his entrance exams to get into Oxford. It's a Byzantine system, and he would be accepted to University College, but not yet Oxford. To get into Oxford, he would have to pass his provisional exam, which included math, something Jack never liked or studied. He failed miserably twice, and perhaps would not get into Oxford. But, of course, bigger issues loomed. We don't know exactly why, but Jack decided that he would serve in the Great War. In France, in the trenches, the war to end all wars. Warney had already entered the military and become quite patriotic. Perhaps that influenced Jack. So after 8 weeks at Oxford, he would be sent to the trenches. The old knock and his dad hoped that Jack would qualify to serve somewhere less dangerous, but Jack was so terrible with machines, he never even learned to drive a car. He was made a second lieutenant in Somerset Light Infantry. Jack doesn't speak much of his time in the war. We know that in January of 1918, he was in the trenches. He wrote in the trenches, quote, "The bombing officer was very nice, a fellow of literary tastes." Just delightful. Bombs are going off. We know that in February, a month later, he came down with trench fever, likely transmitted via lice. While convalescing, he wrote to his father and requested books, among them Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Jack would suffer from melancholy and depression while convalescent, but it wouldn't be the biggest blow for him during wartime. Jack would go back to the trenches, where he noted then he had a, quote, fairly bad time. He wrote from a hospital in France that he had been hit with shrapnel. A shell had burst near him, killing the sergeant next to him, and 3 pieces of shrapnel hit him, 2 in the hands and 1 in the chest, but even that wasn't the worst. Convalescing now in England, he wrote again to his father, but his father failed to visit him. The two had been drifting apart, and Jack, a very young man, wasn't blameless in this, but he wrote his dad apologizing, asking for company and comfort, and his father rejected him. This was perhaps the greatest tragedy for Jack during wartime. There are also 2 important revelations about his faith during this time. In 1919, he wrote to Arthur that he did not believe in God, least of all one that would punish him for the lusts of the flesh. He also told a friend that as bad as things got in the trenches, he would never go so low as to sink to prayer. His faith was extinguished. It was at this time he also met a friend in the army, an Irishman who went by the name of Paddy, and the two were close. They vowed that if something happened to one of them, the other would look after their family. And so when Paddy was killed in the trenches, Jack took to Paddy's family, the divorced Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen. Mrs. Moore had come from a family of clerics. Her parents died by the time she was 18. She had to raise her younger siblings. She was married at 26 and then divorced, moving to England to be near Paddy. Jack would live with Mrs. Moore from 1919. He would be officially admitted to Oxford despite the failing math scores. Because of his war service, he had a room at the college, but would stay with the Moores. Warney would be very critical of Mrs. Moore, but she seemed to function in a variety of ways for Jack. She was 26 years his senior, a motherly figure for a man who lost his mother at 9. But it's also fair to say she likely served in some way, consummated or not, as a kind of Mrs. Robinson. Jack's friend Owen Barfield suggested that it was a 50-50 proposition that they were intimate. And Maureen, her daughter, thought something was going on. We know that the letters between the two were destroyed to not make the collections. And so we have to be careful when speculating. But we have to note that this was not out of character. And another thing that would be shameful to young Jack. It was also at this home, however, away from Oxford, apart from any physical relationship, that the home that Mrs. Moore kept was lively, filled with characters, not academics, the people Jack would learn to speak to. The future popular author would need to be in touch with the everyday person, not just the Oxford crowd or public school crowd. I think it's fair to say that by his 20s, Jack had lived a complicated life, abandoning the faith of his youth, engaging in the life of the mind and also the life of the affections, of imaginary worlds of love and death and sorrow. He had lost his mother in 1908, and his father would be forever a ghost to him. And I think we need to see all of this in context to understand the books that we are going to cherish and love later in life. I think we need to see Jack now in the context of the 1920s. I'm always stuck with this quote from the American novelist Willa Cather, who said, "The world broke in two in 1922 or thereabouts." A generation born from speed, the combustion engine, the railways, its optimism, then crushed by the world wars, the war to end all wars, vague spiritualism giving way to nihilism. In the church, there was modernism fighting fundamentalism. Jack had come not only in history, but in his own life to the watershed. Think of what a watershed is, that thin, relatively small portion of land. Think of the mountain range where that is. One side takes you down one side and the other, perhaps thousands of miles away. So where would Jack go? And if I can, being here at 1517, get personal here for a second, because it is where Jack's story goes. It's a verse that, a Bible story that I shared a few years ago from this very stage. The story of the paralytic, brought by his friends to see Jesus. They bring him, the friends bring him, the friends lift him to the top of the roof, the friends lower him down. And what do we read? Jesus sees their faith and heals the sick man. Let me just reflect a minute, off note. It is going to be significant, as we'll see in Jack's life, the friends he's with, the people, the company he keeps, and that being so central to him recovering his faith and then becoming who he was. It will never not strike me that I'm standing on this stage here in 2023, and for most years, 1517, our Here We Still Stand conference has been here. And I was just talking with Debbie about what an amazing, strange thing this is every year. New faces, but a lot of the same old faces. The importance of this friendship, even though this isn't a church, but we come back once a year and rekindle and talk. I'm reminded that the first year this happened in 2017, from this very stage, someone got up and said, "Dan can't be here. His brain had a heart attack." And through friendship, in faith, I was rehabilitated. It's important who we spend our time with and the messages and the things we tell one another. And this is the story of C.S. Lewis in his 20s. All the tragedy, with all the sin, with all the things he couldn't shake. It was Arthur Greeves, it was his friends at Oxford, where he eventually became a Don, where he argued and laughed over the question of God and forgiveness and Christ. And then, of course, he writes, "It was in Trinity term of 1929 that I gave in. I admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed." Of course, this is where he calls himself the most reluctant convert. Within 2 years, in 1931, he took a walk with Tolkien and his friend Hugo Dyson. They discussed Christianity in particular and the claims of Christ in particular. Jack would go out the next day to the zoo with his brother Warnie and quote, "When we set out by motorcycle to the Whipsnade Zoo, I did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did." The rest, of course, is history. But to finish, I think it's the story that we've talked about this weekend, the story of who Lewis was, that it all makes more sense. It becomes that much richer when we see where he came from, the tragedy of his mom, his own sense of sin, his complicated relationship with his father, Arthur Greaves, Warnie, the war, Mrs. Moore, and whatever strange story that might be, The Great Knock, all the books at Oxford, his believing friends, and of course, the good news of the incarnate God, the myth come true. Thank you.